we're from a company called InLogic, and we do expense management software. So you've got a corporate card and you've got to travel. So we're dealing with transactional expenses and dealing with the banks as well. So we've got online statements that we have to deliver, and we're PCI compliant. So we deliver software to banks who aren't PCI compliant, but they want us to be PCI compliant. So it's a strange one, but that's what we deal with. So a couple of years ago, we started building a new version of our software where we're extracting out one part of it that we used for a different system, and at the time we'd crammed them all into one and just made it work. So we've finally gone back and tried to extract out that single piece of new software, and we started finding these patterns and places where it would break down, and we would be like, oh, what's this magic string that we have to enter here, or I need the URL for this particular resource, but I can't remember if I've got to pass an anonymous object with what parameters, etc. So this is sort of where this library was born out of. It's also something that FUBU MVC guys have done as well, but they sort of created the whole framework where this is sort of what they did, the good parts that they did, put on top of ASP.NET MVC. Like I said, it's open source and it's on GitHub, and we do use it in production. So it's not just some library that we came up with in theory. We are using it, and it has already saved time. So the getting started story is very easy. Install the package. There's a couple of namespaces that you have to replace out. So you take out the ones that refer to system.web MVC.html, replace them with those ones, and then you add some conventions in. They're just the default conventions that show you. There's a whole heap, and you can create your own as we go along. So I do have a little video just showing the getting started story. We all know how to install a package from NuGet these days, so it uses FUBU core and HTML tags library, so it's built around the HTML tags library really, which is sort of extends like a jQuery like syntax for building HTML, if you think about it like that. So you go and add the package, you take out the we'll uncomment the SchoStack ones, and then we'll put back in, take out the system.web.mvc ones. And then this convention factory is where you register all your HTML conventions. So by default we've included the default ones, the data annotation ones, and the validation ones for data annotations. Then we've just got our simple get started home view model with a name property. We pass that to the view, and then in the view we have HTML.input X for the name property, and that will run through all the conventions and then build an input based on that property. So you would do what you need to do to get the view model into a state where you can render that directly in your view. So when I run that, we get a text box because that's the default for an input for a string, and you can see it's got the ID and the name set up. So they're sort of the defaults out of the box that sort of come with the library. So I'll pass it over to Michael to sort of dig deeper into the conventions.
Thanks, Adam. Okay, so as Adam was saying before, SchoStack uses the HTML tags library. That's available on NuGet as well. So it allows us to build HTML tags in a Fluent-like syntax in C#. By default, we get rid of the text box, checkbox, drop-down, and other type of HTML helpers, and we allow you to define your own types for, well, the three main categories, which are inputs, displays, and labels. So conventions can actually be applied to these tags. They can be appended onto or even overridden. So the two main methods of doing it is build and modify. So up here, the first one is showing you how to do it with a display, which will create you a span tag and put the text inside of it. The next one down is a label, and that'll actually give you a label tag with the for, sets the ID, and putting the text of the accessor of what you're putting in. And the next one down is a input with a text box and throwing the value in. Note that if you have multiple definitions, you'll actually slowly override what you've done previously. If you want to append onto the end, you use the modify tag. So in this case we're saying, hey, all the inputs that we previously defined up there, we actually want to add onto it this attribute here of the name. You can also set up conditional conventions. So these conditional conventions are always and if. So our example here is for our display, if it's an enum type, we want to modify it so that we're actually putting the text in for the enum value, as well as setting up the attribute for enum with the type. Not only can you do these conventions over the whole system, but you can actually apply them to sections. So you've got this profiles. So by using these profiles, you'll actually put this into your razor syntax, and you've got this using here, which will define the scope of how you're going to be using this profile. So this input control will be using this new widget settings HTML profile defined up here, and so we'll be using the standard HTML conventions and then our own ones in particular for these widget settings. So the usage of these HTML tags is you define your typical razor syntax of @HTML.input with your accessor or label, display, there's validation message for validation, and form. You can also add specifics onto each single one. So for instance, if you've got a scenario where you need to apply a particular class to it, you just say add class, or there's other accessors such as text, or another one is, I'm just trying to remember, attribute, so you can add attribute and data on, things like that. I'll now hand you over to Adam to talk about URL generation.
Cool. So in SchoStack, it has a pretty good idea of how to use URLs within your application. Each controller action takes one unique input model and sends out one unique output model. So what you can do with that is that the input models get bound to your routes that you can see there in the route attribute there. That then allows you to use the HTML helpers that we've made, such as URL4, to generate that URL in your code, and you also create it with any necessary like product IDs or anything like that you have in your URLs. You can also use it when creating forms in the same manner that you can see down the bottom there. So going on from there with form generation, use the same using syntax that you saw earlier, and you define an input model, and with this you can also hook up more HTML conventions. One that we use in Logic is that every time we make a form, we add a anti-forgery token, and that really simplifies a lot of the code that we have to write. And from there you can also drive validations from your input models. In Logic we also use a library called FluentValidation. If you haven't seen it before or used it, has a Fluent syntax for building rules on input models. So, for example, you can use non-empty length, etc. You can see up there, and to build it, you just make a class there, inherit from abstract validator, give it a type, and then you can go about defining all the rules such as non-empty and so on. And what SchoStack does is that it provides another library which is totally opt-in. You don't have to use it, but allows you to define the validations for you, on your input models instead of your view models. So as you're creating your model, you can say this is required, this is so and so, and it really saves you a lot of time. And the rules can also generate client-side validation as well. The client-side validation code that gets generated is specific to jQuery validate. So it'll highlight your inputs red and etc. and show messages when necessary. And bringing all this together, it gives you a solid convention-based stack to use for your application. So now I'll hand it over back to Mike to talk about controllers.
So I'm sure we've all dealt with controllers in typical ASP.MVC where you stuff a whole ton of stuff into it and it just gets messy. Well, the idea with SchoStack is you keep it pretty simple and straightforward. You should only be taking one thing in and returning one thing. So in our case here, we've got our route set up for logon/status. This will take in our query model of the status, which we can pass through to our message handler, which I'll talk more about in a sec. We expect it to be returning a logon status view model, which will pass into our partial view. So these message handlers, they're a great way of actually separating it away from the controller, your business logic. By doing this, it means you can get more back down to the unit of work methodology and really push your testing a lot further, since you're only working with units of work. You can take in, you set up with a handler here, which is your input and your output. This handler will take it in. So the query model here will actually take it in. You can run your business logic through here, and then you output your view model. So this will take it back to the controller, and it's completely independent, so it can be called in multiple places. The message handlers can be constructed and they are injectable. In theory, you can have them running out of process, so you can run them in a service bus or something like that, put Rabbit MQ in between to handle it, whatever you need to be. We cover the three scenarios with it, which is you want to take in an input and return something, or you just want to take an input on its own, or you just want to return something. I'll actually hand you back over to Adam now to give you a demo.
Okay, so I've recorded this again, hopefully, and so I'll just pause it there for a sec. So you can see here we've got our routes, home/cake. We've got our get and our post, so that they have the same name, so they'll post back to each other. And we're following the get post redirect pattern here. So we do our get, then we post to this with our input model. If it's not valid, we return the original. Otherwise, we do something and then redirect. And here you'll see the redirect. We say we'll redirect to the URL where that query model maps to. Okay, so you'll see as I play this out that when we look at our query model, we've actually got a property on there called ID. And so if we wanted to redirect to the home query model with the ID of 5, then we just set that up on that object when we pass it into URL4. So when you end up putting these in your views and everything like that, all your URLs, if you do use the MVC build views flag, you'll actually get compile time errors about whether you've broken where the URL goes to, or you've got a URL that directs to another part of the site that may have changed, or you can go ahead and change that home/cake. Everything else can stay the same because you haven't referenced the URL at any point as well. And instead of, the typical MVC way is to use, an action string and a control string, and that can still fall over if you happen to change those names. So in this way, if the class changes, you do your refactor, and that can change in the views and everywhere else where you're linking to it. So here you'll see also that we've got on our input model, we've got our required attributes. So I've opted out of FluentValidation. Maybe this is a simple project and I don't need that complexity, so I can just use the data annotation stuff. I've opted out of the declarative syntax for the controller because I've just got a simple control that doesn't do many things. So all of these things you can either use parts of it or not use parts of it. You don't have to be all in or all out. I'll let that play again. So just quickly here you'll see that the query comes in and we just append the query.id to the title there. Get the message if there is a message, otherwise we'll get null, and we're setting the name to Phil. So we run this and we get this. So you'll see at the top that says my demo title 0. That's because obviously when you create a class and you've got an int property, the default value is 0. So if you wanted no value to come up there, you'd make it a nullable int. So if you also notice that the like cake is a checkbox. So that was a boolean on the view model, so by default that will be the checkbox. Like I said, that's the default. If you want to override it and create something else on maybe you have an attribute on your boolean property that says I want it to be a drop down of yes, no. And if you want that, well, you can do that. You can just set it, have an attribute on your boolean class and say this is going to be a drop down, and then have a convention that looks for that attribute and then overrides the default checkbox rendering. So we submit that. Bill doesn't like cake. We have the like cake. Bill does like cake. So, and this is an example of how we're passing in the ID and it gets passed through. So what if you wanted to make the, when Bill doesn't like cake, we want the message to be red. And when he does, we want it to be green. So how would we go about that? Well, we create a convention. So we do that by, just pause it there, by creating this convention. This convention says that for all the displays, so when you use html.display, this convention will get applied, but only if the value coming from the data, so the property itself, it has a value that contains doesn't, then this modification will run. And then we're just saying with it you get past the tag and the request, and so now we're just going to modify the HTML tag to add this two inline styles, color and background color. And then what we need to do is to add that to our factory of conventions. So in this case, because it's just a simple one, we don't have profiles, but we can add it to the global ASA under the convention factory here. So just after all the other ones, like I said before, the modifiers get run in order that they're registered. So we want all the normal ones to run, then we'll run our one. So we'll run that again. And when you submit, Bill doesn't like cake, and it's got the red. And if we submit it with, we get it without. The other things that are included are little helpers. So if you've ever done a for each loop and you wanted to have text boxes, say, at every inside that loop, so you wanted to do an editable list, you'll know that when you do a for each, you need to specify what number it is. So the I value, if you're doing a for loop or whatever. So you've either got to create an I outside of the for each and then increment it at the bottom, or all of this stuff that just makes it a little bit more painful than it should be. So with the loop helpers, you can just say HTML.loop, pass it the enumerable, and then inside that you get another HTML.input, and that is only the property on that list. So it does the iteration and everything for you. We've got feature controllers, which have, if you want to group your controllers and your views in the same folder. If you may have seen that pattern where people are, maybe they'll log on and they'll put their views, their controllers, their business logic in the same folder, and then have different ones of those. So you don't want to do the traditional controller view separate folder style. We've got the cookie temp data provider. So temp data uses session by default, and since no one's using session here, if you want to use temp data, then cookie is the best spot to persist it across a request. Select list extensions. So this select list is used for rendering drop downs. So if you have a property and you have a list of select list item, by default that's going to render a drop down for you. So this is the way this select list extension takes is an extension method that extends I enumerable of t, and then you set what property is going to be the display, what property is going to be the value, and what's the selected value, and that'll build it all for you. And then there's some client-side helpers as well. So if you wanted to do fire off a request to do validation via Ajax, you can then call render errors, and that'll give you back, it'll render all the errors in place where they should be. And it also supports the native jQuery unobtrusive validation attributes, not the Microsoft ones that they packaged and do an adapter for. So you can either have the out-of-the-box Microsoft ones or the native jQuery ones. And we are hiring, as all good people are. So yeah, we're doing, like I said, we've got 7 developers at the moment. We're doing mobile applications using Cordova and Angular and ASP MVC applications. So if you like what you saw or what you heard, come and have a chat. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and if anyone has any questions, you can ask them now.
What support is there for testing of these sort of libraries? Because I've always had trouble with FluentValidation when it comes to testing, or not just FluentValidation, but any sort of Fluent stuff. You always seem to end up mocking lots of stuff to get them to work. So is that eased up a little bit more?
Well, we actually kind of created a framework around it. We don't have it as part of.
No, it's not part of it yet.
But it's probably worth us throwing it up there. Instead of worrying about the whole idea of, well, let's set up our inputs and so forth. We're not really concerned about our inputs. We just want to make sure that we've set them up more so.
Yeah.
So our situation is to say, hey, on this piece of data, we just want to verify that you've got not empty or something like that. And so we've set up a framework for that. And you can also test the specific scenario where you've got a when case. So, something like a cascading drop down, and when you get to that selection that you fill in this because it's like the other option, so that text box shouldn't be empty. So we've kind of set up those models as well.
Yeah, and the conventions, obviously you can run your conventions and then say HTML.import and make sure that that class, because HTML input returns a HTML tag and then it gets implicitly converted to a string in the Razor view. It means if you're just testing that HTML.input, you can actually then get the HTML.tag strongly typed class out and ask it, do you have this class? When I've set up a convention, did you apply that convention? So you can test all your conventions by actually running through that HTML.input and then verifying it programmatically.
Finding ending up with sort of quite large messy controllers, given there's a lot of sort of front end code in those profiles?
No, not at all. Our controllers are. So sorry, the question was, are the controllers messy? with that declarative syntax that we use, they're normally no longer than 5 lines. So we actually, per action, we normally group, say, you might group 10 or 20 even. But because they're declarative, you can say, oh, this takes in this input and returns this. And so using, Visual Studio, you can say, well, what implements those classes? So you can find the handlers really quickly. You can find the validation really quickly from there, because you can just look for what inherits from abstract validator of that input type. But yeah, that declarative syntax was to clean up the controllers such that they're, if this returns this, then we're going to return JSON. If it's, false, we're going to redirect to a different page, or if it's whatever. But you can set up there's an on statement as well, so you can set up an on and say, if this was returned from the handler, then I want to do X.
And we've also been experimenting with another idea recently, is that our controllers are based on features. So not so much based on, your typical, slash this, slash that. We're actually focusing on a particular feature. So, for instance, if we need to display a card statement, well, that would be a whole namespace in itself, and breaking it down into those particular things. It means that you've only got a few actions per controller then. And the same with the message handlers inside that space. You've only got a few.
Yes. So I'll just quickly show you what the loop looks like, if you want to see. So here's what the form would look like. So we don't even specify what the URL is here. We're just saying that this form is for the HTTP home input model. It knows whether it's a post or a get as well, based on how it looked it up in the beginning. So it looks for that HTTP post attribute. So this knows that this is going to submit via a post. And then here we say for each item in this list, then item.input name. And so you can nest them as well as you go down. Cool. Thank you.